I had just finished my Saturday yoga class. I was driving out of the parking lot of the center, and I had just come to the exit, and I brought my car to a stop because someone was coming, and then my yoga mat rolled off the roof of my car. I was very frustrated. I don't know if any of you go to the center, but I can tell you that parking lot is a zoo. People like to go around those corners around 20 miles an hour, and if you don't hurry up and do whatever it is you're trying to do, they will begin to honk at you. And so here I was at the exit, my yoga mat on the sidewalk. I was going to have to get out of my car and go pick it up, and I was going to have to listen to all that honking going on when a couple of women came down the sidewalk, and one of them waved to me, and she went and picked up my yoga mat. Ooh, I was so excited. And she passed it to me through the window, and then she and her friend said, "We see a lot of people who do this after yoga." And I said, "Yeah, maybe that's part of yoga." You know, they didn't have to stop. They didn't have to help me. And yet they did. They kept me from having to get out of the car, walk in front of the car, park, etc. They kept me from being honked at. They even smiled at me. I was so happy. Sometimes these little things really make my day. Well, we find out in Mark that Jesus is someone who interrupts what he's doing when he sees someone in need, like someone whose yoga mat rolled off their roof. And in our story for today, we see two very important people who interrupt Jesus in the middle of his teaching. Listen with me to this story in Mark, chapter 5, starting with verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered round him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live." And so he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather she grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say who touched you?" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years old. And they were overcome with amazement. Jesus was a person who was constantly being interrupted. And he allowed it. He allowed himself to be interrupted. If we had a need like one of those folks in our story, or maybe just a little need, how likely do you think it would be that when we cried out for help, someone would stop everything they were doing and rush to us and help? Maybe, if we're a small child in the presence of our parents. Otherwise, not so likely. And what about the times when we are the ones who are busy? We are the ones that can't be interrupted. When I was an administrator at Lutheran General Hospital, I could barely ever be interrupted. I had a secretary, an office secretary, parked at my door, and she screened everything. Only a dire emergency would cause her to tap on my door. We would communicate by little memo pad pieces of paper that she would hand to me as I would leave the office and go to another meeting. Such a way of living, of not ever being able to be interrupted, it would have been foreign to Jesus. Because Jesus was always letting himself be interrupted, like this day. You know, teaching was the most important thing that a rabbi could do. It was the number one thing. And yet, Jesus had a huge crowd gathered with him that day. And when a man fell at his feet, literally fell face first down at Jesus' feet, he stopped teaching and he went with him. Now, this man was a leader. He was the president of the congregation. He was the leader of the synagogue. But that wasn't the reason why Jesus interrupted himself immediately. It was because the need of that man was so great. His daughter was dying. Now, any of you who have been parents know what it is like if something happens to your child. You want to rush to their rescue immediately. And this father had that same desire. His little girl was at home and she was dying, but he couldn't do anything. He was helpless. And that's why he fell on his face to Jesus and begged, please, please come. And immediately Jesus got up and he went with that man toward his house. But there was a tiny little interruption that happened along the way. While they were rushing to his house, someone in that huge crowd that was pressing in grabbed the hem of Jesus' garment. It was so small that nobody around could tell who it was, but Jesus knew. He felt something. And she knew too, because she felt something. Now, she was a person who was having hemorrhages. She was bleeding, which means that she could not even be there. Women who were bleeding are unclean. This woman had been unclean for 12 years. And the fact that she was even going to show up in a crowd in her state was dangerous, if anybody happened to know or notice her. So that's why she snuck up and she just took a little touch, thinking that Jesus would heal her and then she could slip away and nobody would know and all would be fine. But Jesus noticed, and he stopped. Imagine what it was like when he stopped. The president of the synagogue at his side. My daughter is dying. Why are you stopping? And then the disciples, when he asked them, who touched me? How are we supposed to know who touched you? It's a huge crowd. And then the crowd itself. What's happening? Why is he stopping? And finally, the woman who was hiding and didn't want to even show her face. And now Jesus was stopping, and he was looking for her. Finally, she decided she just had to go up to him and tell him the whole truth, right in front of all these people. And when she began to do that, Jesus just said, daughter, your faith has made you whole. He called her a daughter. This is a woman who couldn't be in public for 12 years, and he called her a daughter. He stopped and took time for her just so that she could be restored to the community, so that she could be with human beings again. He stopped for that. Jesus always stopped, and he even stopped for women. He even stopped for little girls. This was very unusual in his day. And you know the history of humankind's inhumanity to little girls and to women is one of the horrific, darkest pieces of our history. Back in the first century, when little girls were born, they were put out to die. People did not want to have girls. And even today, in modern times in China, when families have a choice and they can only have one child, if they have a daughter, they'll leave her outside to be exposed and to die. People want boys in China if they only have one child. And even now, all over the world, there's human trafficking. And so young women are trapped in a cycle of inhumanity, their bodies being sold for profit and their lives lived in virtual slavery. These are the ones, the women, the little girls, through the centuries, who have had no voice. But Jesus listens to those who have no voice. He listened to a middle-aged woman who was an absolute nobody in those days. She was single, she was destitute, and she shouldn't have even been there. And he took time for her. But as soon as he was done with that little moment, he began to rush again toward the synagogue leader's home. And as he was going, perhaps because he had taken a few moments to stop, people started crowding in on him and saying, "Just give up, Jesus. She's dead." They even told Jairus the same thing. "Don't bother the teacher. Your daughter has died." But Jesus kept pushing forward. And then when he got to the house, there were professional mourners. They had those in Jesus' day. Professional mourners at the door, wailing and playing flutes. And they tried to push him away and say, get out of here, the child is dead. And Jesus said, no, this will not be a public display. I am going in. And he pushed them aside, taking only the little girl's father and 2 or 3 disciples. And he made the people be quiet. And he went up to that little girl, took her hand, and said, "Daughter, get up. And she got up. No one saw it except her parents and Jesus and a few disciples. But she was healed. She lived again. And so I ask you today, what does it take to get us to be interrupted? What does it take for us to hear? What does it take for us to listen to these voices that are now silenced? What does it take for us to put down our cell phones and to look around at the world that surrounds us in all its ugly truth? What does it take for us to hear the screams of children in detention centers and prison camps all over our world? What does it take? I ask myself that. And I pray each day that God will help me to be interrupted, to listen, to see, and to act. Will you join me? If we just allow ourselves to stop and to be interrupted, we have taken the first step to helping the little boys and the little girls and the grown-ups in our world begin to live.